The morning sun had barely peeked through the airport windows as Dr. Maya stepped into the bustling terminal of San Francisco International Airport. Her eyes were heavy after a grueling 12-hour emergency surgery that had saved a young child's life. As a pediatric surgeon, she was used to long hours, but this case had been particularly challenging. Still, there was a slight spring in her step. She was finally heading home to see her family after 6 long months. Wheeling her small carry-on suitcase, she navigated through the crowded terminal, occasionally checking her boarding pass for Flight 2317 to Chicago. The familiar scent of coffee from airport cafes filled the air, tempting her, but she decided to head straight to her gate. She hadn't seen her parents in far too long, and the thought of her mom's home-cooked meals made her smile despite her exhaustion. At the gate, she found herself surrounded by the usual mix of travelers. Business people in crisp suits tapping away at laptops, families trying to keep young children entertained, and fellow solo travelers lost in their phones or books. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the start of boarding. Maya gathered her things, double-checking that her medical journal was safely tucked into her bag. As she waited in line, she overheard snippets of conversations around her. A grandmother excited to meet her newborn grandchild. A businessman rushing home for his daughter's dance recital. A couple heading to their wedding. These little stories always fascinated her. Every flight was like a tiny community in the sky, each passenger carrying their own hopes and dreams. When it was her turn, Maya handed over her boarding pass with a friendly smile. The gate agent barely glanced at her, scanning the document with mechanical efficiency. Maya didn't think much of it. Everyone was probably having a long day. She made her way down the jet bridge, the familiar airplane smell growing stronger with each step. Finding her seat in row 23C, she efficiently stowed her bag in the overhead compartment. The morning light streamed through the small oval window, casting a warm glow across the cabin. She settled into her seat, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. A family with 2 dumb kids took their seats across the aisle, the children's excitement bringing another smile to her face. As other passengers continued boarding, Maya observed the flight attendants greeting people with warm smiles and helping them find space for their bags. She noticed how they joked with some passengers and cooed at babies, creating a welcoming atmosphere. Yet when one of them passed by her row, the warmth seemed to evaporate. The flight attendant's smile became fixed, almost plastic, and their eyes skipped over her as if she were invisible. Maya pulled out her phone, sending a quick text to her mom. "On the plane now. Can't wait to taste your famous biryani." She then switched it to airplane mode, pulled out her medical journal, and tried to focus on an interesting article about innovative pediatric surgical techniques. But something felt off. A subtle shift in the atmosphere around her that she couldn't quite put her finger on. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their flight time to Chicago. As the safety demonstration began, Maya noticed that the flight attendants seemed to direct their instructions to every row except hers. It was such a small thing, so small that she wondered if she was just being oversensitive due to her exhaustion. Little did she know that this subtle difference in treatment was just the beginning of what would become one of the most memorable flights of her life. Not for the reasons she might have expected, but for how it would challenge her, inspire others, and ultimately bring out the best in a plane full of strangers at 30,000 feet. 2 hours into the flight, the gentle hum of the engines had lulled many passengers into a peaceful sleep. Dr. Maya had managed to read through several pages of her medical journal, though her throat was becoming increasingly dry at this altitude. She watched as the drink cart slowly made its way down the aisle, accompanied by the familiar clink of ice cubes and the soft hiss of opening soda cans. The flight attendant cheerfully served the elderly couple in row 22, taking time to help them arrange their drinks on their tray tables. Maya sat up straighter, getting ready to request some water. But as the cart reached her row, something odd happened. The flight attendant smoothly pivoted to serve the family sitting across the aisle, completely bypassing her. Maya gently raised her hand. "Excuse me?" Her voice was polite, professional, the same tone she used when speaking with nervous parents before surgery. The flight attendant continued chatting with the family across the aisle, seemingly deaf to her request. A businessman 2 rows back caught Maya's eye and furrowed his brow, clearly noticing the strange interaction. Thinking it might have been an honest oversight, Maya waited patiently for the cart to finish serving the next few rows. Perhaps they would come back. She watched as other passengers received their drinks with friendly smiles and casual conversation. Some even got extra snacks after brief, friendly chats with the crew. Finally, as the cart was about to move past her row again, Maya spoke up a bit more firmly. "Excuse me, I'd like some water, please." This time, the flight attendant turned, fixing her with a look that could freeze coffee. "You'll have to wait your turn," came the curt response, despite Maya having already waited through 2 passes of the cart. The mother sitting across the aisle glanced over, a mix of confusion and concern crossing her face. Her young daughter, no more than 6, whispered something, and the mother quickly shushed her, throwing an apologetic look in Maya's direction. The drink service continued down the aisle, and Maya noticed how the same flight attendant who had dismissed her was now cheerfully helping an elderly man choose between different types of juice, even offering him extra ice when he hadn't asked for it. The contrast was striking, yet so subtle that someone not paying attention might miss it. A few minutes later, a different flight attendant passed by with water for someone in the back who had requested it. Maya tried again, raising her hand politely. "Could I please get some water as well?" The new flight attendant paused for a split second, glanced toward the front of the plane, where the first flight attendant was standing, then replied, "You'll need to wait for the next service round." The businessman who had noticed earlier caught Maya's attention again and wordlessly offered her his untouched water bottle. Maya smiled but politely declined with a small shake of her head. This wasn't about the water anymore. It was about something far more significant. She pulled out her phone and quietly began making notes about what was happening. Times, specific responses, descriptions of interactions. Her medical training had taught her the importance of documenting everything precisely and objectively. As she typed, she could feel her heart beating a little faster, not from anger, but from a deep sense of purpose. She had faced subtle discrimination before, but something felt different this time. The young girl across the aisle caught her eye again and held up her own cup of apple juice, offering it with the pure, uncomplicated kindness that only children seem to possess. Maya smiled warmly at her, touched by the gesture. The girl's mother, who had been watching the entire situation unfold, gave Maya a subtle nod, a small but clear sign of solidarity. As the flight continued its journey eastward, Maya couldn't help but notice how this simple request for water had revealed something larger. What started as a routine flight was transforming into something else entirely, and she could sense that more passengers were beginning to notice the disparate treatment. The air in the cabin felt charged with an unspoken tension, like the moments before a summer storm. The cabin lights brightened as the smell of warmed airplane meals began wafting through the air. Dr. Maya's stomach growled softly. She hadn't eaten since her quick breakfast before the emergency surgery. She'd been looking forward to the vegetarian meal she carefully pre-ordered 2 weeks ago, knowing that long flights could be tricky with her dietary preferences. As the food service began, she watched the methodical way the flight attendants distributed meals, checking their manifests and confirming orders with passengers. The businessman who had noticed the water incident earlier received his pre-ordered low-sodium meal with a friendly flourish. "Here's your special meal, sir. Would you like some extra bread with that?" When the cart reached Maya's row, she sat up expectantly. The lead flight attendant, a different one from the water incident, consulted her list with exaggerated attention. "I don't see any special meal ordered for this seat," she announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "There must be a mistake," Maya said quietly. "I ordered a vegetarian meal 2 weeks ago. I have the confirmation email." She reached for her phone to show the proof, but the flight attendant had already moved on to serving the family across the aisle. "I'm sorry," the flight attendant said, not sounding sorry at all. "But if it's not on my list, there's nothing I can do. You should have confirmed multiple times before boarding." She emphasized the word multiple, as if speaking to a child who had failed to do their homework. The young girl across the aisle, who had offered her juice earlier, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered loudly in that way children do, "why is that lady being so mean?" Her mother shushed her again, but the question hung in the air, clear and uncomfortable. An older gentleman, a few rows ahead, turned around, his kind face creased with concern. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said. "I actually ordered a vegetarian meal too, but I'd be happy to trade with you. I can eat the regular option." Before Maya could respond, the lead flight attendant cut in. "Sir, we can't allow meal exchanges. It's against our policy." This was a new policy to everyone who heard it, including a off-duty pilot sitting nearby who raised his eyebrows in surprise. Maya took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her the value of staying calm. She pulled out her phone again, adding this incident to her growing notes. The timestamp read 2:45 p.m. A young woman sitting in the row behind Maya leaned forward. "I'm recording this for my social media," she whispered. "This isn't right." Maya gave her a small nod, but continued documenting everything herself, her medical training kicking in. Objective observations, specific quotes, exact times. The food service continued around them, the aroma of meals making the situation even more uncomfortable. The businessman who had noticed earlier was now openly taking notes on his laptop. The off-duty pilot had struck up a quiet conversation with another crew member, gesturing discreetly toward the lead flight attendant. Maya's stomach growled again, but it was no longer just about the meal. Each interaction was building a clear pattern, one that was becoming impossible for others to ignore. The cabin felt different now. Passengers who had been absorbed in their movies or books were paying attention. Small acts of kindness began to emerge. A granola bar quietly passed forward, an apple rolled across the aisle. A pack of crackers dropped accidentally onto her tray table. The lead flight attendant noticed these gestures and her expression hardened. She moved quickly through the rest of the meal service, but the damage was done. What had started as subtle discrimination had become glaringly obvious to everyone around. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from the usual sleepy long-haul flight to something charged with purpose and quiet solidarity. As Maya documented each detail, she noticed her hands weren't shaking with anger or fear. Instead, she felt a steady resolve. Sometimes the most powerful response to unfairness isn't a loud confrontation. It's the quiet, determined documentation of truth, supported by the silent witness of those around you. As the flight continued eastward, the cabin temperature began to drop noticeably. Dr. Maya could see her breath forming tiny clouds in the air-conditioned cabin. She wasn't alone in feeling the chill. Passengers around her were pulling on sweaters and jackets. The little girl across the aisle had curled up under her Disney princess blanket, only her eyes peeking out as she continued to watch the unfolding events with innocent curiosity. A flight attendant, the same one from the water incident, appeared with a stack of blue airline blankets. She moved down the aisle, distributing them with practiced efficiency. "Would you like a blanket?" she asked the businessman who had been taking notes. He accepted with a nod, watching carefully as she continued her rounds. When she reached Maya's row, she didn't even pause. Instead, she leaned across Maya to hand blankets to both passengers sitting in the window and middle seats next to her. The contrast was so stark that several nearby passengers stopped their conversations mid-sentence. The older gentleman, who had offered to swap his meal earlier, raised his hand. "Miss, I believe you forgot to offer a blanket to the lady in the aisle seat." His voice was gentle but firm, the kind of tone that commanded attention without aggression. The flight attendant's response was immediate and rehearsed. "I'm sorry, we've run out of blankets." She continued down the aisle, where Maya could clearly see at least a dozen blankets still stacked in her arms. The businessman who had received a blanket earlier immediately began to stand up, but Maya caught his eye and shook her head slightly. She had already pulled out her phone, adding this latest incident to her growing documentation. The timestamp glowed on her screen, 3:30 p.m. The off-duty pilot, who had been observing everything, pressed his call button. When a different flight attendant responded, he engaged in a quiet but intense conversation, occasionally glancing in Maya's direction. The flight attendant's face showed increasing discomfort as he spoke. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening throughout the cabin. The young woman with social media expertise had silently started a chain reaction. She typed something on her phone and showed it to her seatmate, who showed it to someone else, and so on. Soon, phones throughout the nearby rows were lighting up as passengers added their own observations and evidence to a growing digital record. The mother across the aisle suddenly announced, loud enough for several rows to hear, "It's quite cold in here, isn't it? I wonder why some passengers aren't being offered blankets." Her voice carried just the right mix of innocence and pointed observation. Her daughter, still wrapped in her princess blanket, looked at Maya with big eyes. "Mommy, can we share our blanket? Like we do at home when watching movies?" The pure kindness in her voice cut through the tension like a warm ray of sunshine. Before anyone could respond, something unexpected happened. Passengers from several rows ahead and behind began offering their own blankets to Maya. One elderly woman removed her personal travel blanket from her carry-on and insisted Maya take it. "I have another one," she said with a knowing smile, though everyone could see she didn't. The flight attendant who had denied Maya the blanket returned to find the scene of quiet solidarity. Her face flushed as she hurried past, but not before the off-duty pilot called out, "I believe we need to document this situation for the airline's passenger service review." His words carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what procedures were being violated. Maya sat there, warm now under a borrowed blanket, touched by these acts of kindness, but aware that this was about something much bigger than staying warm on a cold flight. She watched as passengers who had been strangers just hours ago exchanged knowing looks and supportive nods. The cabin had transformed from a space of individual travelers into a community united by a shared sense of justice. The young social media expert caught Maya's attention and discreetly showed her phone screen. Comments and reactions were already pouring in from her initial posts, turning this flight into something none of them had expected. A moment that would resonate far beyond these cramped airline seats at 30,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the afternoon sun played hide and seek with the clouds outside. Dr. Maya sat quietly in her seat, her borrowed blanket warm around her shoulders as she organized her thoughts and documentation. Her phone screen showed a carefully detailed timeline of events, each incident recorded with the precision she usually reserved for surgical notes. The young social media expert behind her leaned forward again. "My first post about what's happening has already been shared thousands of times," she whispered. "People are asking how you're staying so calm." Maya smiled softly, thinking about all the times she had to maintain her composure during complex surgeries. This situation was different, but the principle was the same. Staying focused and professional was often the most powerful response. The businessman who had been taking notes suddenly cleared his throat. "I'm actually a civil rights attorney," he said quietly. "Would you mind if I added my observations to your documentation?" "What's happening here?" "Well, I've seen this pattern before." His eyes held a mix of professional interest and personal concern. As they compared notes, the off-duty pilot walked past, pretending to stretch his legs. He paused briefly near their seats. "Just so you know," he murmured, "several crew members from other flights are already discussing this on our internal channels. This isn't going unnoticed." The mother across the aisle had been quiet for a while, but now she spoke up. My daughter asked me why we're all taking notes and pictures, she said, loud enough for nearby rows to hear. I told her we're showing how important it is to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Her daughter nodded solemnly, still clutching her princess blanket. A flight attendant, not one involved in the previous incidents, approached Maya with an apologetic expression. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Some of us have been trying to." She glanced nervously toward the front of the plane and didn't finish her sentence, but her meaning was clear. The elderly woman who had given up her blanket earlier reached across the aisle to pat Maya's hand. "When I was young," she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience, "people stayed quiet about these things. It warms my heart to see everyone coming together like this." Maya noticed how the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What started as subtle discrimination had transformed into something unexpected, a lesson in human dignity and collective action. Passengers who had been absorbed in their own worlds were now engaged in quiet conversations, sharing their own stories of similar experiences. The young social media expert's phone kept lighting up with notifications. "People are asking what airline this is," she said. "They're saying they want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The businessman turned attorney nodded approvingly, adding another note to his growing document. A teenage boy from a few rows ahead walked past, pretending to head to the bathroom. As he passed Maya's seat, he dropped a small paper on her tray table. It was a sketch of her sitting calmly in her seat, surrounded by supportive passengers, with the words "Quiet Strength" written beneath it. The simple artwork captured the moment perfectly. The lead flight attendant who had denied Maya's meal earlier passed by again, her demeanor noticeably different now. She could see passengers documenting her every move, their phones ready to record any further incidents. The power dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation, but through peaceful, organized resistance. Maya looked at her phone again, reviewing her notes. Each incident was there, recorded with professional detachment. The water service at 1:45 p.m. The meal denial at 2:45 p.m. The blanket incident at 3:30 p.m. But between these lines were other timestamps. Moments of kindness, small acts of solidarity, whispered words of support. These too were part of the story. As the flight continued its journey eastward, Maya realized that what had started as a personal experience of discrimination had become something larger. In this metal tube high above the earth, a community had formed, united by a shared sense of justice and human dignity. Their response wasn't just about one passenger on one flight. It was about standing up for what was right, one small gesture at a time. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they were 2 hours from Chicago. In those brief hours, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What began as a typical flight had become a powerful demonstration of humanity at its best, all sparked by consistent mistreatment of one passenger. As if on cue, a small group began to form. The civil rights attorney stood up first, straightening his tie as he glanced towards the front of the plane. The off-duty pilot joined him, followed by the elderly woman who had given up her blanket. They moved deliberately toward the lead flight attendant's station, their purpose clear in their measured steps. The young girl across the aisle tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Are they going to help the nice doctor lady?" she asked, loud enough for several rows to hear. Her innocent question seemed to capture what everyone was thinking. The lead flight attendant saw them approaching and visibly stiffened. The civil rights attorney spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "We represent a concerned group of passengers," he began, gesturing to include the entire cabin. "We've documented numerous incidents of discriminatory behavior during this flight." The social media expert had her phone ready, though she wasn't recording, just making her presence known. Her earlier posts had gained significant traction, with people worldwide now following the story as it unfolded. "The internet is watching," she said quietly, showing the flight attendant her screen full of supportive comments and shares. Dr. Maya remained in her seat, still documenting everything with professional precision. She caught fragments of the conversation. Airline policy, passenger rights, witness statements. The off-duty pilot's voice carried particular weight as he detailed specific violations of airline service protocols. Other passengers began sharing their observations. A teacher from row 25 described the water incident in detail. A businesswoman mentioned how she'd watched the blanket distribution, noting the clear pattern of discrimination. Each person spoke calmly, their words measured but firm. The small girl, still wrapped in her princess blanket, suddenly stood up on her seat despite her mother's gentle protests. "My mommy says we should always be kind," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying the simple wisdom of childhood. Several passengers nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears at the pure truth in her words. The elderly woman who had given up her blanket earlier added her perspective. "I've seen enough in my lifetime to know when something isn't right," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And what happened today wasn't right." The lead flight attendant's professional mask began to crack. She glanced around the cabin, seeming to realize for the first time how many passengers were watching and documenting. The other flight attendants hovered nearby, some looking uncomfortable, others showing subtle signs of support for the passengers' intervention. Through it all, Dr. Maya's calm presence served as an anchor. Her methodical documentation, professional demeanor, and quiet dignity had inspired others to act. She'd shown everyone that sometimes the strongest response to discrimination isn't loud confrontation, but peaceful, organized resistance. The civil rights attorney pulled out his business card, handing it to the lead flight attendant. "We'll be filing a formal complaint with the airline," he stated. "But more importantly, we want to ensure this never happens to another passenger." The young social media expert's phone buzzed continuously with notifications. "People are asking how they can support this cause," she announced. "They're sharing their own similar experiences. This is becoming something bigger than just one flight." As the group returned to their seats, a quiet ripple of approval moved through the cabin. The little girl waved at Maya, flashing a gap-toothed smile that seemed to brighten the entire plane. Her mother mouthed a silent thank you, though it wasn't clear if she was thanking Maya for setting an example for her daughter, or for bringing out the best in everyone around them. The flight was approaching its final hours, but everyone knew this story was far from over. What happened at 30,000 feet that day would resonate far beyond the confines of Flight 2317, touching lives and inspiring changes in ways none of them could have predicted when they first boarded. The plane began its descent into Chicago, the city lights twinkling below like scattered stars. As the captain announced their final approach, there was a palpable sense that this flight would be remembered for more than just its destination. The events that had unfolded over the past few hours had touched everyone on board in unexpected ways. 2 airline representatives were already waiting at the gate when they landed. Word of what had happened had traveled fast. The young social media expert's posts had reached the airline's corporate offices before the plane even touched down. Her latest update showed over 50,000 shares and counting. As passengers began gathering their belongings, something remarkable happened. Instead of the usual rush to exit, people stayed in their seats, waiting. The civil rights attorney stood up first, gesturing for Dr. Maya to lead the way. One by one, passengers stood in silence, forming an impromptu honor guard in the narrow aisle. The little girl who had offered her juiced hours earlier broke the silence. "Goodbye, Dr. Lady," she called out, waving her princess blanket like a flag. Her mother smiled proudly, holding her daughter's other hand. "Thank you for teaching us all something important today," she added softly. The elderly woman who had given up her blanket pressed a small note into Maya's hand. "For your parents," she whispered. "They should know what an amazing daughter they raised." Maya felt tears welling up for the first time that day, touched by this simple gesture of understanding. The off-duty pilot had already spoken with the airline representatives, explaining the situation from an insider's perspective. The businessman-turned-attorney had his documentation ready, complete with timestamps, witness statements, and detailed accounts from multiple passengers. The social media expert's phone continued buzzing with messages of support from around the world. As Maya stepped into the terminal, she was surprised to find news crews waiting. The story had spread beyond social media, touching a nerve in a world hungry for examples of people standing up for what's right. But what made headlines wasn't just the discrimination. It was the way an entire plane full of strangers had come together in response. The airline representatives approached Maya with profuse apologies, but she gently redirected their attention. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice carrying the same calm strength she'd shown throughout the flight. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The little girl's mother stepped forward, still holding her daughter's hand. "We all saw what happened," she said to the representatives. "But more importantly, we saw how people can come together to make things right." Her daughter nodded solemnly, still clutching her princess blanket. Other passengers began sharing their contact information, offering to provide statements or testimony if needed. The civil rights attorney had already begun drafting a comprehensive report that would later lead to significant changes in airline training policies. The social media expert's hashtag was trending nationwide, sparking important conversations about discrimination in public spaces. The off-duty pilot approached Maya one last time. "You changed more than just one flight today," he said quietly. "You showed everyone the power of responding to discrimination with dignity and strength." Several other airline staff members nodded in agreement, some taking notes for their own future reference. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya finally checked her phone. Among the numerous notifications was a message from her mother. "We're waiting at arrivals. Dad made your favorite dinner." This simple reminder of home and family made her smile. After all, this extraordinary day had started with nothing more than a desire to visit her parents. The elderly woman who had given up her blanket was the last to leave. "You know," she said, her eyes twinkling, "sometimes the most powerful changes start with just one person refusing to accept injustice." She patted Maya's hand one final time before disappearing into the terminal. Standing there in the bustling airport, Maya reflected on how a routine flight had transformed into something much more meaningful. What began as a simple journey home had become a testament to the power of human dignity, quiet strength, and the willingness of strangers to stand together against injustice. The real impact of Flight 2317 wouldn't be measured in miles traveled, but in the lives touched and the changes it would inspire long after everyone had reached their destinations.